Greetings everyone and welcome back to 365 Days of Prog. It is me, Wet Hair Naomi, and today we're reviewing the album Mouse by the band Aragon.
Hi, my name's Naomi. I'm an avid progressive rock fan, but I'm a long ways from knowing all the prog albums out there. But this year, I'm gonna give it a try. This is 365 Days of Prog.
So, Mouse by Aragon. This is a very long album and I'm gonna get to that when I review it, but beforehand I have to share with you my favorite bits from the album. Now, considering the fact that this is almost, and I think, an hour and a half long, there are not a lot of favorite bits, and that might already give you a glimpse of what I think about this one. But without further ado, here are my favorite bits from Mouse. This album is a concept album by the Australian band named Aragon, and the idea of this album is the story of a mouse seeing the world from its own perspective, and all of that being a metaphor as an autobiographical story about the band themselves. Now, the idea on here is really good, but I think the performance and the execution of it is just pretty frippin' bad. And this album, it was in the making for a long while. It had a lot of pressure on releasing it, and thus it was released in two parts, where the fifth, I think, act of this album was released as a separate piece, and only like 3 years later was the entirety of the album also released to the public as one whole. And you know that an album made under pressure usually doesn't go all that well. There are certain anomalies here and there of albums that were pretty well made under pressure, but this one is just the complete opposite of that. Under pressure. So this album, it really does fall short on many fronts, but I think one of the biggest things that you could say that really led to this album's downfall is the fact that they decided to record an album without a drummer and a bassist. Now, I'm not saying anything. Music can be whatever you like it to be. You can do music with whatever instruments you want to do that. But when you do decide to use bass and drums without actually having players playing them, which means they're, synthetic, they're not real, you're really giving up a lot of the magic that you might want to create with the music itself. And that's really what's found on here. Because those two leading, rhythm instruments are basically absent on this album, I might say that they are so monotonous and so uninspiring throughout the entire album that it just makes it, at some points, really unbearable to hear. Now, all of that could have been compromisable if, there were really sick guitar and keyboard solos on top of them and you wouldn't really notice the rhythm going in the background. But this album just makes an entirely focused use on just singing and basic rhythm going over and over and over again in the background, and it just really doesn't feel like any good music would want to do that. And I think this band, I don't know what's going on with them, but they think this is a good creation and I don't see where they're coming from, basically, because this is so basic, so simple, so boring and so disinteresting that I really don't know what this album is all about. The other major fatal flaw in this album, which is really sticking out, is of course the lead singer, which really tries to do the emotional Peter Gabriel voice in his singing style, but he just doesn't have that range, he doesn't have those abilities, it sounds strained all the time. And the other thing that really bugged me with the way he sings is the fact that it doesn't match the music itself in the background. So you can't really have mellow music, like gentle music, and then sing scream your lungs out and think that those two would match perfectly all together. No, there's just too big of a dissonance between those two, and I think this album really sins on that behalf a lot of times. So yeah, so far my criticism towards this album is pretty negative. Another thing which I really don't like about this is the amount of tracks found here. This album has 35, yes, I'm gonna say it again, 35 separate tracks on it. Now, When I make my list and actually rate these songs, I number them with Roman numerals. And this album actually made me question my own knowledge of Roman numerals, because I was getting into like the far territory of the 30s and I was not like expecting to do that. And another thing which really bugged me about this album, but that's not the band's fault at all, is the fact that I could only find it on Bandcamp. So it wasn't on YouTube, it wasn't on Spotify and other streaming services. I could only find the album over there, and I had to listen to it in like this really wonky like style, so it wasn't really nice, and I'm sure that extracting out pieces of it to put in my favorite bits would also be a bit of a daunting task. But I went on a bit of a tangent over there. What I was saying about the length of this album is that not only is it really long, it's unjustifiable. I think a lot of the tracks on here are transition pieces. A lot of them aren't even like, musical. They're just like people speaking, doing something, background voices basically. And I think that a lot of these tracks are just really not meant to be there, and if they are, they're really cutting the vibe of this album and just creating this dissonance in the flow, and I don't really like that. And another thing is about the way that this album is sectioned is the fact that some songs are literally cut in the middle and considered like different songs. If you take, for example, the three first songs of this album, I think the three of them could have been like one long piece without any cuts in it, and I don't really understand why they chose to do that. So overall, if the cutting and the splicing on this album would have been done correctly, I think it could have cut off at least like 10 songs off this album and maybe even made it a bit shorter. So unfortunately, when listening to this album, I kind of gave up on it, like when listening to it, and I think that's really bad, because I started reviewing it like very critically and hoping that some things would get better in time and some ideas would develop and stuff like that. But as I was getting into this, I was so obsessed with just getting it done with that I started hating on this album like uncontrollably, and all the songs sounded bad and more bad, and just as it kept going on, I didn't really have any fun listening to this one. Now, that is to say, there are a few good tracks on here, and the idea of them is that they're good because they're not really, synthesized. There are a few tracks on here that you really can hear some beautiful playing, which is really authentic because it's played on the acoustic guitar and they're singing on it, and it matches really well, and that's real music right there. And that just goes to show that real recorded live music, by real players, is really all what this thing is about. I think that the best tracks that are found on here are the real instrumental tracks. My favorite track on here is one of those songs that uses the guitar really intricately and beautifully, and it's called Midsummer's Night Dream. I think it's a cool song, and if I were to find it on any other album, I'd say that it's actually a pretty good song, and I'd rate it pretty well. But of course, in the context of this album, this is like a majorly good song compared to the others, and I think this is the first time I've actually ever given a song a rating of 2. But I'm not gonna tell you which one it is. Instead, we're gonna move on to talking about the cover of this album. Now, this album is really interesting because, as I said, it was released in 2 separate parts, which the second one is basically the entire piece. Now, it has 2 separate covers for that idea, and the idea, it does stay the same. They both have the mouse on them, it's the same drawing, but they look pretty different. I think they are both pretty cool, but if I had to choose one which is better at representing what's on this album and actually what you're going to listen to, I would say that it had to be the second cover. This one right here, down here, is the one that was released with the full album itself, and this one over here is just the 5th stage of the album. So I'd have to say that the second one really does represent it quite well, and it's overall a pretty decent cover. But unfortunately, and I think you all could have seen it coming, this album receives a disappointing 3 out of 10. This is the first on the channel. I know I was about to give this album a 4, but then I looked at the other 4s I had on this list, and I just had to come to the conclusion that it was actually worse than those, and that is why it is getting a 3. Now, if you love this album, I'm really sorry. I am sorry, but I'm really hoping that someone could tell me what you really like about this album down in the comments. I was searching online on the Prog archive, seeing what other people think about this album, and I think my reviews are pretty similar to a lot of different people. Maybe I'm being too harsh I don't know, but that's just what I felt listening to this one. But anyway guys, I hope that you enjoyed this one, and stay tuned for tomorrow because we're going to be listening to The Fountain Beyond the Sunrise by the band Kyrie Eilison or Ellison, or I don't know, but they're Austrian, they're cool, and we're gonna have a fun time doing so I hope you all catch me, or I catch you. What am I saying? See you all tomorrow. Bye guys.